Well, speaking of the trouble that Ricardo had, it was a very one-sided battle in the battle for P3 in the constructors in Mexico. I think McLaren were pretty fortunate and worked pretty hard to get that 1 point compared to Ferrari's 18. I think Ferrari managed to score. So it was I was kind of prepared for a pretty bad result because the whole weekend was signifying pretty clearly that it was going to be a struggle and that Ferrari seemed to be looking quite good. Their package was not quite so affected by the conditions and the environment. So, we ended up with this very one-sided battle. Ricciardo put himself out of contention right at the start, of course. Norris actually had a really good race because he started from P18, I believe, and finished with a point. So gaining 8 places in a race where lots of people were struggling to even get close and overtake people, I thought that he did a really good job and it was executed nicely. That was about the most that they could hope for, really. But Ferrari, on the other hand, they were brilliant. Like the Sainz has now had 11 consecutive points finishes, I believe, and Charles Leclerc. They couldn't get anywhere near Gasly. Charles Leclerc did have a little go at trying to close the gap, didn't really get anywhere, and they ended up swapping back by the end. So there was a nice little, clearly a good relationship between the two drivers. They'd had an understanding about it beforehand and agreed to it as a result. But both of them were pretty impressive, and they managed to bring home some great points for the team, and that secured them the P3 in the standings, as we'll look at them later. But there was no battle to be had when you compare it to the United States, when we actually saw some good on-track action. We got absolutely nothing like that here to Mexico, and I do feel that it might be quite difficult for McLaren to overturn that now, looking at recent form. I don't know if that's because they're putting more effort now into next year's car. Ferrari seem to be bringing more upgrades still. They've had quite a few engine improvements recently. So, I'm a bit concerned it's going to be difficult for McLaren to overturn that now, and it was absolutely advantage Ferrari after the Mexican Grand Prix.
There's a lot of speculation with regards to McLaren's performance, whether it was due to the altitude or not, and we've mentioned that already. That's one of the highest tracks on the calendar. And the air is so thin that actually the DRS doesn't work very well. The engines are working so much harder to bring in the air they need to work. And obviously the Mercedes struggled because they weren't as fast as the Red Bull, so therefore the McLaren was on a struggle as well. And the Ferrari, like you said, just seemed to have got it right this weekend. They have done at Mexican Grand Prix before. They've done well. Do you think that going to Brazil in a couple of days' time, also quite high up, that the altitude is going to affect them just as much? Or I know you're hoping for a closer battle between McLaren and Ferrari, but realistically, where do you see both teams sitting going forward into the next race at a similar altitude?
Brazil, I'm not sure what the height difference actually is. I don't think it's quite as drastic as Mexico City.
It's the similar height to. It's not as high, but it's the second most close. It's as close to Mexico as any other track.
Okay, well, it's a very, very different track. It's a very short track as before, but the profile of it is very different. There's a lot more elevation changes and the like. It's hard to say exactly how that will affect the cars. Like I said, I still think that there's a reasonable belief that Ferrari have got the advantage now, and they tend to do quite well on tracks that have a lot of sort of slower corners and tend to be a bit more twisty. It's just something to do with their aero and the nature of the McLaren car by comparison. I'd like to think that when you look at a performance like Sainz in 2019, for example, where he went from the back of the grid to P3, there must be something within that, because I don't think the car concept has changed that much since then. I think that there's a chance that there's still some good performance to be found there, and they're not going to struggle in quite the same way that they did in Mexico. At least I certainly hope not. And Norris has taken an engine penalty. He's got new components that he's dealing with as well. So I don't think it'll be quite as drastic. The altitude difference probably makes the biggest difference on that long straight because the DRS is not as effective. And like you said, the engines have to work that much harder. and the turbos as well, then you've got to bring in a lot of air, but the actual air that you're bringing in is quite thin. Then in order for it to have the same effect, you obviously have to bring in that much more air. And you saw the cooling, for example, that they had on the back of the cars, these much wider cooling units compared to other tracks on the calendar. So it clearly makes a big difference. Whereas in Brazil, we're not likely to see something like that because it doesn't have this massive, great big straight that basically constitutes nearly a third of the track.
No, exactly.
So I hopefully it won't be quite as drastic.